Conservative manifesto this morning as breaking news. Anyway, I'm delighted to be joined for this by a very distinguished panel, perhaps not quite the distinguished panel you're expecting when you originally signed up. Because of the election, two of the MPs were expected, one MP, one aspirant MP had to pull out, and then very unfortunately this morning, Tim Montgomery bailed on us. World's worst joke. Tim Montgomery is not feeling well, but in his place, we have Tim Bale, who, like stars in their eyes, today will be channeling his inner conservative. No, Tim, of course, you know, as a professor at Queen Mary University London, very distinguished observer of the Conservative Party. So he will be giving us insights into the Conservative approach that they will be taking at this election, particularly as they're under threat from reform on their right. I'm also delighted to be joined not by a representative of the Labour Party, but by Naomi Smith from Best of Britain. Naomi is going to be channeling the more liberal side of the immigration debate, and to give us all distinguished and perhaps more sort of independent, less partisan commentary. I'm very delighted to be joined by Randall Hansen from University of Toronto. So what we're going to do is I'm going to kick off a few questions, and then I'm very keen to get lots of questions in. If you want to use Slido, I'm sure that the questions will be coming up here, even though Anand completely blanked all the questions I put in on the first session and then claimed that they didn't come through. I think that's a user failure, but anyway. So we'll take some in the room and hopefully some will come through online. So, Randall, our question is, what role will immigration play in the general election? But we heard in one of the earlier sessions your sort of, a brief sketch of your analysis of what role immigration has played in previous UK general elections. So, is immigration always a big factor in elections, or is this going to be, as Nigel Farage has said, an immigration elections, does that make it stand out as very different from earlier elections?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I thought about this, the scan back, and yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Jill. Very good to be here with this distinguished panel. So I thought about when immigration was played a fundamental role in UK elections, and the answer is never. Not in 1958 after the race riots, not in 1962 after the 1964 after the Beat the Band rush, not in 1968 into 70 despite the Kenyan Asians crisis. The closest we came was in 1970 when Enoch Powell made a 2-minute to midnight appeal to vote for the Conservatives. And of course, Labour unexpectedly lost that election, so the speculation was, did that play a role? When you break it down to the constituency level, it might have had a bit of an effect in the Midlands, but probably in constituencies that were breaking Tory anyway. Labour lost because of dreadful balance of payments news that came out just a few days before the election. So it's never played, and all due respect, actually no respect to Nigel Farage, this will not be an immigration election. The Tories are heading to oblivion for many reasons, austerity, 15 years of economic stagnation, the disaster that was Brexit. Immigration will have nothing to do with it.
Does it not even play, and we heard, I think, from Patrick English in the previous session about how immigration was becoming a valence issue. So even if you maybe share what the government's trying to do on migration, you just think they're incompetent at doing it. And one of the sort of narratives, I think Jane Green's done some work about competent shocks, and we've looked at the fact that Liz Truss lost the economic competence. Have the Conservatives lost competence on migration?
Oh no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the first manifestation of this panel, and then suggests that I give advice to the political parties on what to do with this immigration, and he clearly decided in the interim that my advice isn't worth listening to, so that was no longer part of my instructions. But had I given that advice, I would have said to Labour, you may attack the Tories for the handling of immigration. Do not, which he's done, do not promise to reduce immigration, as Starmer has done. So yes, I think you're right, but then it's not an issue of immigration. It's an issue of incompetence, and it applies to multiple fields.
So, Tim, Nigel Farage snapping at the Conservatives' heels, debates about whether we get to that famous crossover moment with reform. Rishi Sunak has now sort of unveiled his pitch. I mean, does he need to make immigration an issue? Is this a helpful issue? And which bits of the Conservative coalition, the broad church, not the Amazon warehouse or whatever, to misquote Robert Buckland, is immigration helpful with?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, you can look at the opinion polls and see, as we've already seen, that Conservative voters are far more concerned about immigration than is the case with Labour voters. So there is a natural tendency on the part of the Conservatives, obviously, to pitch to the voters that, you know, they want to hold on to, and boy, do they need to hold on to those voters because they are very worried about them moving to reform. And I think Nigel Farage's entry into the campaign is a real problem for the Tories with regard actually to their pitch on immigration, because so much of it was intended to try and pull those voters who were tempted to go to reform back to the Conservatives. And now he's in it. It's very difficult to see that that is going to work. Now, that presents the Tories with a dilemma. Do they try and move even further onto that reform territory, which strikes me as unlikely to be particularly successful, or do they somehow kind of pivot, reset and dial down the rhetoric on migration? I think you can actually see in some ways, when you look at the Tory manifesto that's just come out, that they haven't been tempted to go as far as some people on the, if you like, populist radical right in the Conservative Party would like them to go on this particular issue. They haven't, for example, news to some of you perhaps, promised to get out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is one possibility and something that a lot of Conservative MPs have called for. They have, in the manifesto that's just been released, suggested that they want some kind of international summit or conference in which they try and rearrange the international rules, but that's a very vague promise. The only other things in the Conservative manifesto that strike me as new, we've heard about most of them, including the one that they foreground in the manifesto, which is this new cap on migration, which is going to be apparently advised upon by the Migration Advisory Council and then voted on every year by Parliament. But the only new thing I can see in there actually that I didn't know about is health checks for migrants, which goes back a very long way, plays into, and I know we've got James Hampshire here at Sussex University, who's written about this quite a long time ago, but plays into this idea that migrants are a kind of threat, if you like, to the health of the body politic in the literal as well as the metaphorical sense. So I don't think Rishi Sunak, in other words, is going to go much further than he already has. It's the cap, it's Rwanda, it's increasing visa fees, and the health surcharge for migrants. Because there's no way he can outdo Farage. In other words, you can't out Nigel on this front.
I mean, I was just going to go through. I mean, we've got some stuff on illegal migration, as Tim said. Proposal for an international summit on rewriting asylum treaties, and we've got a 5-point plan. We will introduce a binding legal cap set on work and family visas, so public services are protected while we bring in the skills our business and the NHS needs. Cap will be set at a level that explicitly takes into account costs and benefits. Cap will fall every year of the next Parliament. We will give Parliament an annual vote. Unlike Labour, we won't allow any form of free movement to return. Do you have sort of any grasp of what a sort of sensible cap might look like? Because capping net migration is always one of David Cameron's big problems, is that nets are difference between two numbers, and we don't control outward migration. So
I think this goes back to the conversation that if you were here this morning, people were talking about, as it were, depoliticising migration, and the idea that it will be some sort of OBR for migration. And I think in some ways the idea of the cap is to make the MAC function in that way, in other words, to get the MAC to decide what the cap would be. But I don't suppose that many people, either on the MAC or who know a lot about the MAC, would be very comfortable with them doing that, because it's just, you know, an almost impossible task. And it always strikes me as interesting about the Conservative Party, which for so long, certainly since the 1970s, is condemned in the economic sphere the idea that you can pick winners, seems to think that when it comes to migration, you can do exactly that. So in other words, you can tell who and with what skills, you know, people should come in order to benefit your economy, when it's actually very, very difficult to do that. As somebody wrote, I think it was last week, you know, if we'd looked at that in the 1950s or something, we would have said, oh, well, let's bring in more miners or something. But that wouldn't have been a great idea for the long-term future of the British economy.
Okay, so we're centrally planning the labour force here, which is quite an interesting idea, though some of us were sort of yelping in the earlier session that the OBR just judges whether the government meets its own fiscal rules, and the MPC is set an inflation target by the government, so it doesn't necessarily get you out of the big policy question there. Naomi, we've got the accusation here from the Conservatives that Labour would allow a return to some form of free movement. Would they?
I wish. Well, let's not forget, it was a Conservative government that was initially pursuing some kind of youth mobility scheme with the EU not a year ago. And George Eustace, you know, former UKIP councillor turned Conservative minister, was very much championing that, particularly for, you know, agri-food sector. So there's that. Look, I wasn't in the Clause 5 meeting. I have no idea what is or isn't going to make it into the Labour manifesto on any of this. But I'd be surprised if they weren't going to think about youth mobility, which of course we know is very, very popular with Leave voters. I mean, at Best of Britain we do constituency level polling on this topic and more, and even Boston and Skegness, you know, highest Leave vote in the country. Leave voters there perfectly comfortable with 18 to 35-year-olds having visa-free access for a 5-year limit. And of course we have similar schemes for lots of other countries around the world, so it would make business sense. Business certainly needs it, university sector needs it, and nobody seems to have too much of a problem with it. In terms of the question posed to our panel today, I think the answer is very little until Farage entered the race, and now a little bit more. I don't think it is the overriding issue, which, you know, the polling shows is cost of living, health and public services. I think Ipsos last week had polling showing that even 2019 Conservative voters will admit that public services have declined over the last 14 years. So the extent to which those voters will make any kind of causal link between immigration either exacerbating the public service problem, or, you know, because there are too many migrants using the NHS, or whether they come at it from the other angle of insufficient number of migrants to keep our public services going, I don't know. But.
So one of the issues that is sort of very foregrounded, though, in the election appears to be housing as quite an interesting battleground, and pressure on housing and home ownership. And I think we're hearing about that being a reason perhaps for changing attitudes to immigration in Canada that we were mentioning earlier. One of the people mentioned, I think interviewed by Sam Friedman and James's chatbot, did actually make that link. You know, there is huge big population increases, we're not building very many houses, put the two together, and immigration is actually one of the reasons why there are a lot of homeless people, or why my children can't afford or can't get a house. I mean, do you think that's a danger area for Labour?
Well, certainly when you look at shortage occupation, construction's right up there in terms of needing more people to come here and help us build those homes. Without question, successive governments of you know, all coalition, Labour and Conservative have failed their socioeconomic policies have failed to deliver at volume the number of homes that we need. And I'm very delighted that Randall is here, because Canada has, I don't need to tell this room, been a bit of a beacon for having a much less laissez-faire attitude by the state towards immigration, and having a far more interventionist approach with helping immigrants to settle, to learn language, etc. And it sounds like now housing is perhaps the thing that hasn't kept pace there and is beginning to bite, for sure. It's not the fault of migrants, it's the fault of the governments that haven't built enough homes, and who are now making it more difficult for the people who can build homes to come here and do it.
Randall, is housing a sort of way in for people to raise the migrant issue?
Well, yeah, again, as I said from the floor this morning, it was in Canada, and two things surprised me. One, that for so long no one in Canada made the link between immigration and housing on the right. You bring 300,000 people a year to the country, 100,000 of them end up in the greater Toronto area, playing the same economic role as London. That is going to create a housing issue. And in the main, new immigrants to Canada do not want to live in a crowded, moldy flat in the center of the city because they think it's urban and cool. They want a single detached house as part of the North American dream. So it surprised me that it took so long. When it occurred, it was a very Machiavellian and clever way of demonizing immigration without demonizing immigration. So it certainly can happen here. I think Naomi's response was an excellent one. It's also more complicated. Many of the migrants who come to the United Kingdom are lower down the skill set than Canadians, and so very often they're crowding into quite inadequate housing, many to a room. But the scholarly evidence on this is clear. You only have affordable housing not when you have high, low, or medium levels of immigration. It's when the state builds large amounts of middle-class housing, and that has been the success in Vienna. And since the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher, the state has utterly withdrawn from that. Add to that the speculative use of housing in this country as a substitute for rising wages since the 1970s, and it's a disaster of which immigration plays a very, very small part.
Randall, just staying with you, we've just had elections to the European Parliament, and what's sort of perceived to be relatively success for some of the parties on the right. There's a little bit of shift towards the European People's Party, significant losses for the Greens and Emmanuel Macron, basically, as far as I can see. To what extent has, concerns about migration played that role? One of the most sort of, anti-immigrant prime ministers, Giorgia Meloni, seems to be a relative winner despite incumbency in it. Is that playing a big role in European politics at the moment?
Oh, it's huge. It's one of the anchors of the far-right success. But let's make a very clear distinction between volume and management. Publics will support very high levels of immigration in the hundreds of thousands, and you get one boat with 9 people that arrives off the west coast of British Columbia, and suddenly immigration is a massive issue. So it's not the volume of immigration which is creating the backlash. It is the boats, and you see this in the United Kingdom. You had 785,000 net migrants in the year to June 2023, and the 35 to 40,000 that came on the channel caused a massive reaction. So as I said in my question this morning, you need to recreate a perception of control. And I actually made a dreadful mistake this morning, which I want to correct. 2 mistakes. I decided not to drink last night, and I'll never do that again because I wasn't at all clear this morning. I reversed it. Those coming on the boats to the United Kingdom are refugees. They're getting about 75 to 80% recognition rates. The only way to get control there is to bloody well process them, stop politicize them. The ones that are economic migrants in the main are the ones in the Mediterranean going to Italy. So creating a perception of control for the EU is about opening legal routes. For the United Kingdom, it is about processing, and it's about coping with the Brexit penalty, because exiting from the Dublin framework means that the UK cannot now go to the European Union and say, these are your responsibilities too. So there has to be a rapprochement with the EU on this. I drifted a bit. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think it's very. I'm going to come to the audience for questions, but I just got a question here from Anonymous on Slido. That's not from me. Asking what would be the.
Alan, he's up there.
No, he wouldn't know how to do it. He wouldn't, I don't think Alan's ever knowingly asked a question on Slido. This is. What would be the impact of promising removing discounted immigration health surcharge rate for students to get 8,000 new police roles on voters? So I just wanted, Tim, I just want to come to the cost of migration in the UK and how that might play out, because this is one area where the UK is a really big outlier in how much it costs to be a migrant and how much it then costs as a migrant here to progress through to citizenship or stay a migrant. Yet this seems to be the sort of next sort of slush fund to go to after you've exhausted how much you can get through clamping down tax avoidance. And we had this announcement earlier this week, we pay for new police officers. I sent it to my niece's American husband saying, hope you're pleased that you're going to be taxed more, you don't get a vote and stuff like that. You know, do the Conservatives really just regard this as absolute free hit territory that you can just go on charging more and more, you know, and they'll never complain, or, you know?
Yeah, I mean, economists in the room will know better whether, you know, it actually brings in much revenue. I mean, maybe it does, but I mean, I think it's more a rhetorical device than a revenue-raising plan. I mean, the fact that they're, as it were, you know, trading off between, you know, police numbers on the one hand and the sort of surcharge and the visa costs on the other, I think is just very kind of simplistic, you know, politics. It's just saying, well, this is a thing that you think is really bad, lots of people coming to the UK. This is a thing that you think is really good, lots of bobbies on the beat, to quote the Telegraph yesterday. So, you know, we'll put those two things together. Hey presto, that's a great policy for the people we're aiming at. But I don't think it's really any more serious than that, to be honest. I do think, however, that given that we are in a kind of global competition for what the Conservatives actually still in their manifesto insist on calling the brightest and the best, I think it is slightly problematic to make it more difficult and more expensive for people who, you know, if they are skilled, have got a choice between various countries, to make it perhaps, you know, more costly to come to Britain than it is to come to other places. I'm guessing we're relying on the fact that our language is such a huge advantage that people are prepared, for example, to pay more to come to the UK than they would be, for example, to go to Germany. But, you know, it's a risk, I think.
Maybe they think it's reassuringly expensive. Naomi, when I was chairing an event a few years ago on migration, Conservative and Labour Party conferences, at the Conservative Party conference, not a single person in the audience mentioned the costs of the migration system. At Labour, that was almost the only question we got from the audience, was people complaining about the costs on, you know, relatively low-paid migrants, we won't call them low-skilled, relatively low-paid migrants, and the cost of the progression through to citizenship and things like that as being a real sort of barrier to integration. But it is providing, I asked Amber Rudd, who was on our Conservative panel, are you ever concerned about it? She said, well, we need that to fund the system because it's basically used by the Home Office to fund an awful lot of their stuff. But the report suggests that this is actually an area where people think these costs are getting prohibitive, you know, that there's popular support for cutting these costs. Do you think it's an issue that Labour will ever dare address, or will that, you know, fall victim to Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules as well as everything else?
Well, I'm a recovering accountant. I've only recently sort of become a professional campaigner, since 2015, when the referendum was called. So knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing has always annoyed me about rhetorical, political, pre-election policy ideas. And of course, you know, there are just so few political leaders prepared to talk about the value and the net contribution of migrants, and I think it's, you know, over a lifetime getting on for 80,000 per EU migrant, and you know, not that much less for non-EU. So it is very irritating that we haven't got bold political leadership prepared to sort of talk up the contribution to the economy and therefore the impact for everybody else and positive benefits. On the very specific point of Labour, I think and let's all assume Labour-led government within the next 3 weeks, within 18 months they've got a really huge foreign policy moment, of course, with the TCA review, and we won't open up that debate about whether it's a review or an opportunity for talking about more, but within that, if they do want to start to talk about things like youth mobility schemes and the trade of all of that, then will we be asking for British retirees and the Costa del Sol to be able to access healthcare, and in return will Europe want to see lower NHS costs for young Europeans in the UK and things like that? So I think it's possible. It's certainly not going to happen pre-election, but I think within 18 months of a new government, those kinds of conversations probably will be begun to have at least behind closed doors for Labour, if not publicly.
Let's have some questions from the audience. Any questions there? Yes, we've got a gentleman at the back, Marin. Oops, loses Slido.
How many people were returned under the Dublin Agreement?
I'm not. Naomi, do you know?
No, I know the question.
Yeah, Randall.
And I understand the burden of the question. The answer is relatively few. Relatively few were returned. And that's why I think it's ultimately a good thing that the new EU Pact, which has not received a lot of love from NGOs for reasons that are understandable, is effectively moving away from return and looking towards required compensation. So if you're a country in the EU that takes the largest number of refugees, Germany, France, then in principle, Poland, which takes few, will have to pay you for that. But what I will stand by is that being in the European Union meant that you could demand a European response to what is a European problem. And now that the UK has exited the European Union, you cannot do that. And more than that, France has very little political incentive to help. And when you repudiate the international asylum system by effectively, and this hasn't got enough attention, effectively withdrawing from the Geneva Convention, or at least saying you are not respecting it, anyone who arrives in this country by boat is illegal, then how can you go to your partners credibly and say, we are a country, and this is not the United Kingdom I know, we are a country that disavows our international responsibilities, our obligations, and we want cooperation from you to help us. So I hope that Labour will A, broadly realign with the EU, and B, in a bilateral or dealing with the Commission, return to issues of cross-European cooperation.
That's very interesting. So Labour may go to that. They've already been on their visit to Frontex and things like that. Tim, I just wondered, I'll come to more questions. Tim, I just wondered, Rishi Sunak hasn't gone full withdrawal from the ECHR in the manifesto, but if on Naomi's premise that perhaps he's not leader after the election, how do we expect to see this play out? We're even threatened that there might be a rebel manifesto launched next week by Suella Braverman, because this actually isn't an area of unity even on what we'd regard as the right of the Conservative Party, is it? Because that Truss Braverman argument about net migration was quite interesting during Liz Truss's brief premiership. How do you think that might play out?
The situation at the moment, I was talking to Rob Ford about this morning, reminds me of 1997 and the run-up to that election, when you had Conservative MPs individually in their election addresses coming out against the single currency. And you will probably get, I would have thought, a lot of Conservative MPs talking about getting out of the ECHR and making a kind of personal pledge on that, even though obviously the party has decided not to do so. Now that might get a boost if Jenrick and Braverman, as they've sort of suggested in the last couple of days, come out with a kind of mini manifesto on the grounds that Rishi Sunak and the official manifesto hasn't been hard enough. I mean, it will be interesting to see whether that in fact happens. And as to what happens after the election, should the Conservatives lose it, I mean, I don't imagine that Rishi Sunak will stay around very long, so there will be a leadership election. And it is very difficult for me to see, but there may be others in the room who disagree with this, how anyone wins that leadership election without promising that the Conservative Party will get the UK out of the European Convention and promise to do so at the next election. I just think that that will be, you know, the kind of price of entry, if you like, into the leadership contest. There will be many MPs who are uncomfortable with that, it's true. You know, particularly people who are sort of styled as One Nation or moderate Conservatives. But if we know anything about the history of the Conservative Party over the last 5 years, we know that that group of MPs stays, to some extent, infuriatingly silent, while the more vocal minority, if you like, in the parliamentary party seems to make all the running on the issue of migration and various other matters as well. So you know, if the future plays out like the past, I would expect probably those MPs that I've just talked about to keep their heads down and, you know, to put someone into the second round of the leadership contest, which involves the members voting, who, you know, will promise to pull out of the ECHR, and that will be, you know, as far as the membership is concerned, a very kind of sexy promise, and they will, I would assume, vote for someone who does that. And this is all assuming, of course, that Nigel Farage doesn't become the Conservative Party's leader, at least at the next leadership contest, maybe the one after that.
Tim, I was just going to ask you a quick question on the potential rebel manifesto. To what extent is that a pitch for the leadership versus trying to get Reform UK to back off? Because when you've got them on 17%, Tories on 19% as of last week, that could even narrow this week. Is it to try and just keep their seat?
I think that is a really good question. I mean, I think Braverman, you know, does actually believe this stuff. You know, I think like many Conservatives, she is obsessed with the threat from reform, you know, to the detriment actually of the party's electoral performance, because, you know, as many people have said, they're actually losing the same amount, if not more, votes to the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party. You know, so I think she does actually believe that, you know, there is an electoral incentive to do this. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we are seeing two parallel contests here. We're seeing the general election on the one hand, and we're seeing the next Tory leadership campaign being played out at exactly the same time. And Suella Braverman's remarks on immigration, like her remarks on welcoming Nigel Farage into the Conservative Party, because there's not very much difference between us in terms of policies, is actually not necessarily about Nigel Farage winning the Conservative leadership in the long term. It's about Suella Braverman winning the Conservative Party's leadership contest next time around. And it's very interesting that Kemi Badenoch, who is herself quite a culture warrior and, you know, pretty hard line on migration, has decided, you know, against the idea of Nigel Farage coming in. And I guess this is where Braverman and indeed Priti Patel differentiating themselves and presenting themselves as even harder line than the current favourite Badenoch.
Naomi, somebody I was talking to last night was suggesting that actually, you know, didn't want to say it, but that actually, you know, the 50s conventions are looking a bit out of date and possibly shouldn't apply in a modern world. And maybe if we're about to have a Prime Minister who is actually literally wrote the textbook on human rights law, maybe he will be relatively well placed to, in a Nixon to China moment, of actually, you know, use the EPC, conveniently scheduled for the 18th of July, to initiate a process of maybe actually Europe did need to rethink, you know, position on things like the Refugee Convention and stuff like that, and update them for a more modern world. Do you think there's any appetite for that in Labour at all, or do they regard that as a hot potato to be, you know, chucked at the bottom of the channel?
Honest answer, I don't know. And there may well be...
What would be your advice?
Well, they're inheriting such a mess on so many fronts that I think they are going to be desperately thinking about, well, what are the things that we need to prioritise in our 100 days year in order to try and get maybe some less popular stuff out of the way in order to be able to get a second term, because they're not going to be able to undo much of the damage, particularly to public services, in one parliamentary term. I think that the other thing we don't talk about enough on immigration is, of course, climate and the huge impact that it's going to have on the global north, and it's probably not just a Europe thing. I think I would love for our leaders to be having these kinds of conversations very seriously about it, but I don't hear any appetite for sort of a major overhaul of 50s convention from them.
But we should reinstate the 0.7% aid.
Well,
as
indeed,
part of this,
yes.
So Anonymous may be on the same page. Randall, I mean, how do moderate politicians, people who wouldn't see themselves as, in the sort of Braverman and Farage, how do they sort of regain control of a bit of this agenda? Because I think it's that sort of sense that they don't have any answers that's part of the problem. What would be your views on that?
Well, I mean, there's two ways to think about this. What's going to happen to the Conservative Party? And I think they're going to have their ideological opposite to Labour after 1979, which is to say, inevitably, they're going to break off to the far right, where very few British votes actually lie. Lose an election probably too, and very much like Labour themselves, learn the lesson and come back, unless they're overtaken by the Reform Party and literally displaced, which would be, and we're writing, Tim writes these excellent books on the Conservative Party. The next one will be The Strange Death of the Conservative Party. If that...
It's already been taken.
Yeah. If that happens, the UK is much more in a position like France. So that's one aspect of it. The second is how do mainstream politicians lead in general? And I mentioned this morning. One simply has to depoliticize this issue. And the UK went through this debate in the 50s and the 60s when Commonwealth immigration, which is now viewed very positively and a great benefit, a great contribution to the United Kingdom, was highly, highly politicized, the days of Enoch Powell. And both parties eventually decided in the 70s, this is so ugly, and we both lose, that we've got to stop arguing about this. And that's how you have to reach the politicians, above all on the left. You say you don't actually win by politicizing immigration. You do not win by demonizing immigrants, because if the choice comes down between you and Farage on who's most anti-immigration, he's going to come across as a hell of a lot more sincere than you do. So I think that's what mainstream politicians have to do. And as we learned this morning, and we know this historically, when immigration is defended, either because people being tortured in Libyan camps deserve refuge, or from a self-interested point of view, because the United Kingdom needs nurses, needs fruit pickers, the British public responds. Priti Patel is the daughter of Ugandan Asians who weren't expelled, who came just before that. The Ugandan Asians is the most interesting case. When they were expelled by Idi Amin, 6% of the British people supported their entry into the United Kingdom, early August 1972. Over the course of a month, the Conservatives, very much to their credit, said, these people are refugees, they deserve our support, they have our passports, they will end up in concentration camps if we don't let them in. Within a month, 53% of the British people supported that. So politicians can lead on this issue. And when they lead, they win, or don't lose, and it's better for everyone.
Okay, that's another question. We got a gentleman up there, Murray.
Hi. When you say what role will immigration play, I mean, just pure arithmetic. If the Reform Party take 5 to 10% of the Conservative Party in a lot of constituencies, which is looking likely, the size of the Conservative Party could be very, very small after the election, and that has, you've been talking about it, profound effects for many years to come.
So, Tim, how vulnerable are the Conservatives?
I thought you were going to ask me for a prediction of the election result there for
a
frightening moment. No, it's a mugs game. I'm not going to get into that. Yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, I'm always a little bit sceptical about, the idea that the Conservative Party is going to be kind of wiped out or, they're facing an existential threat. That's become my pet peeve, that word, actually, recently. But anyway, however, having looked at some of the polling and obviously, having talked to Rob Ford many times, to Will Jennings many times, and Paula Surridge many times. It's an advert for our book on the general election 2024. I do wonder whether they might actually end up closer to 100 than to 200, in which case we're then left to ask, well, what will the Conservative Party actually in Parliament look like at that point? Now, ironically enough, we may find that it's actually slightly more kind of moderate and one nation than it is right now, because it will have gone back to its heartlands, and its heartlands contain actually a fair few people who do fit that particular description, a fair few people who are from ethnic minorities themselves, although that doesn't guarantee, obviously, that they have quote-unquote progressive attitudes on migration, and a fair few people who, have had ministerial careers themselves. So, it won't necessarily be the kind of, populist radical right, kind of scenery-chewing people that we've got used to over the last few years. But then you have a big mismatch between the parliamentary party on the one hand and the membership on the other, and it's the membership who has the final say on the choice of leader.
If they can't agree it.
If they can't agree it. But I mean, it's very difficult to see them agreeing on a kind of coronation. I think that is quite problematic.
That's like Labour in after 1979, where the party in Parliament was actually quite centrist, and the party leadership was far to the left.
Indeed, 2015 with Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. So I mean, I think if the Conservatives do suffer really badly, it's not necessarily the case that they're going to, in their kind of heart of hearts, be a kind of populist radical right party. The problem for the Conservative Party, and Paul Goodman actually, who used to edit Conservative Home before he had to kind of relinquish the editorship because Lord Ashcroft decided that he didn't want someone who was taking the Conservative whip involved in the project, often refers to something called the right-wing entertainment industry. I would refer to it as the party in the media, or the conservative kind of media ecosystem. But the problem, one of the problems for the Conservative Party, is that is incredibly influential on the MPs and on the way that they kind of perceive politics and the way that they perceive this issue in particular. And I'm afraid that if you read the Telegraph, or even if you just look at the titles of the articles by the people who write the op-eds in the Telegraph, when you look at the Mail and you look at the Express and you look at GB News, there's going to be an awful lot of pressure, even on that quote-unquote more moderate side of the Conservative Party, to move in the kind of ersatz populist radical right direction that the Conservative Party is already, to some extent, moving along.
And Naomi, what do you think, if Labour has a really big majority after the election, will people from outside start lobbying and say, actually, you can be much braver than these sort of wimpish, drippy stuff you've been saying? You can go faster on getting close to the EU, you can, you don't have to reject a sort of youth mobility proposal immediately and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering, on this sort of debate, I mean, do we sort of see that? And would Keir Starmer then come under much more pressure internally from members who think he's being horrendously cautious in order to get over the line, but have sort of grinned and borne it to date?
Well, I mean, one thing that you could be sure is that when the Conservatives make a mistake, their members are angry and then forgive them quite quickly. In Labour, that is not true. If you don't do what they like, they will hold that grudge for a very, very long time. Of course, a very large majority is both good and bad news for some. And the good news is, he can do what he likes. The bad news is you will get members of the PLP able to caucus in the full knowledge that the government will probably be able to get the votes through anyway, and they can sort of agitate and things like that. I think one of the very interesting things that's less talked about in this whole discussion about how small will the Conservative Party be, how large will the Labour Party be, is going to be what the Liberal Democrats decide to do. Remember, under the last large Labour majority under Charles Kennedy, the Lib Dems chose to attack Labour from the left. on many issues, and certainly from progressive, small L liberal causes. However, if under Davey the Lib Dems sort of get similar numbers of MPs, I don't think they will get quite up to that level. I think Kennedy got them to about 62 at one point. But even if they're sort of 40, 50s, given where those seats are likely to be and the voters who will have lent them their vote because of having been completely fed up with the Tories, they will probably not feel that they can do that. So where is the pressure going to come on Starmer within Parliament? Well, it's everything on the right, whether economically or on social issues or culture war issues, etc. So I think that's also very interesting. I think the Greens are going to do well on vote share nationally, but as of course, under the voting system, it may not be enough for them to even hold one seat. I very much hope they do, but they're obviously hoping for at least two. And that sort of means that within the wider public, there may be a yank. That critical mass on some of these issues for Starmer, but in Parliament, that won't be there.
And Naomi, as somebody who's working Best for Britain, do you think that the changes, someone was saying earlier, that the change in the European Parliament elections may mean that there are more, and the change in national politics, there are more governments that are happy to do bilateral deals with the UK, maybe on things. We know that the UK has been hawking bilateral deals around some favoured member states and not others, where the Commission seems to have come out with its proposal slightly preemptively to say, you deal with us guys and you guys get into line. Do you think, what do you think might be happening in the EU on that side in terms, or will they all just be so taken up with political chaos in Germany and France that actually the bandwidth for bothering with the UK is practically zero? Randall, you want to come in?
After you.
Okay, well, look, I think, the latter. The bandwidth and the appetite for wanting to do much with the UK is, I think pretty low. And cherry picking is just such a no-no, whether that is on a bilateral youth mobility thing or on a sector-by-sector thing, that I think they probably will hang together and say it's a multilateral thing.
Who will want to deliberately throw cherry?
Maybe, but I think what we've seen over the weekend is, parties doing well that actually domestically fight each other tooth and nail. So even though they may be big, part of a now larger caucus within Brussels, I can't see it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Firstly, it was said this morning, it was 25%, which is 25% too high for the far right, but nothing near a majority. And there's great divisions within them. The alternative for Germany is too right-wing for Rassemblement National, imagine that. But the idea of bilateral deals, I disagree with what was said this morning. That was the delusion of the Brexit negotiations, is that you could go capital to capital, and the EU completely hang together over something for which the stakes were much higher on both sides. Budapest did not deal with London bilaterally then. It won't do so now.
Okay. Yes, let's go over here. Yeah. Mike coming down.
Yeah, I want to speak to the Randall Hansen. You talk about Canada's situation with migration. Now, I've worked in Canada. Canada is about 50 times the size of the UK. It's got so much land, you could probably have 1 million people come in a year, you wouldn't notice. It's not comparable to the UK or any European country. Second largest country on earth. And like the United States, especially during the question is, how can you apply that when we've got 750,000 people coming in net each year now, and that's the size of Manchester as a city if you want to build the houses for them. There isn't the housing crisis in Canada that you'd have here because we don't have the space. One thing politicians can't do is change the size of the square mileage of the UK. In fact, it gets smaller.
I think
with
only
global
13% of our land is actually built on. But anyway, Randall.
Yeah.
But we're not as big as Canada,
Yeah.
though arguably more habitable.
No. Let me take lengthy the question. I have to say, I rather agree, which is probably not the response you wanted. People come to me all the time and say, what are the lessons of Canada for Europe? And I say, I don't work on Canada. I just live in Canada. It doesn't mean I work on Canada. I work on Europe. And I always say there are, in fact, no lessons for Canada. Because Canada is geographically isolated. It doesn't have porous borders. It's not above a zone for violence. So I'm the last person that will actually say that Canada has lessons for the UK or the rest of Europe. It does not. Where I do slightly disagree is on the issue of numbers. Because Canada's massive, but it's completely uninhabitable for the most part. I mean, no one wants to live in northern Manitoba for good reasons. You wouldn't survive the winter. You would find your carcass when the spring comes sometime in late August. Where I think there is a comparison is that, as I said, there are 300,000, 100,000 of them end up in Toronto, which is a city of about 6 million now. So Toronto is having the same sort of challenges that London and other British cities do. And then I repeat the point that migration for a long time was popular because it was viewed as controlled, and that sense of control is now being lost, and support is going down. But on the question of lessons, I couldn't agree more.
Okay, yeah. Okay, another question here, Mirren.
Thank you. For most people in the UK, immigration has been sort of focusing on non-European countries, immigration from non-European countries. With climate change taking place at the south of the EU, where food shortages could come from within Europe because of the loss of that, temperatures rising higher, going over perhaps even 50, like the Emirates, Dubai, you're looking at the millions that are living in that area that are going to probably migrate from the south to the north of Europe. And the purpose of Brexit was really to prevent actually EU citizens coming to the UK. So it's preventing something like probably 20, 30 million EU citizens coming to the UK in that scenario. Now, the question is, what do you think? Because the face of immigration is, and the focus politically for MPs, Parliament, is going to be not looking at it from outside of Europe, but the subject matter is going to be immigration and people trying to come from the EU. How do you view the politics that's likely to come about between the UK and EU countries, that politics playing a role in general elections in the future? Do you see that there would be a role where it would come like that or not?
So, Randall. Oh, that's...
No, I think the mic's for you. Yeah. I've got
you
one.
don't need one. You don't need one.
Yeah.
So, Randall, do we see... I mean, because we've actually seen net migration from the EU go negative sort of recently since Brexit, as we've lost lots of EU citizens, and some EU countries will be pleased about that. Some of the Baltic states who are very worried about losing too many of their younger skilled population to us and training people we didn't bother to train and stuff. But do we see pressure coming up with climate? Southern Spain, Greece, Southern Italy, or whatever?
Yeah, there was a lot of questions in there. I mean, on the general issue of climate migration, they're not climate refugees, because whatever the weather does, it doesn't persecute. And you have to be persecuted to be a refugee, as much as it might feel like that in London or in Toronto in January. You are not being persecuted. So the question is climate migration. And of course, it is going to occur. But take the current predictions of 200 million, 300 million, light a match and burn them, because they are completely useless. Why? Because they were formed by looking at hotspots where climate change effects are going to be most intense, looking at the people, and extrapolating to movement. It's completely useless. It's completely useless because institutions are a fundamental variable intervening. The more robust and resilient a country's institutions are, the more it can cope within country to those changes. I mean, there have been climate change migrants in Australia and Alberta and British Columbia. Near my hometown, a town exploded 2 summers ago. 0 migrants because the institutions can't cope with them. And as in all forced migration, the vast majority will be internal. My view, I hadn't actually thought of this question, but my view is I really don't think it's going to be much of an issue for the United Kingdom of Southern Europeans moving north. The country is no longer part of the European Union, so there's a free movement, and I don't think many of them are going to move anyway.
It's a politics,
Yeah,
though, of
no.
it between UK and EU countries.
I mean, there are lots of other places in the EU that people could move to as well, which is you could go to
and-
Germany, Sweden.
I mean, there was the
whatever.
most ludicrous article in a Canadian paper that Paris is going to be abandoned because of heat. Yes, the French are going to abandon Paris. That's going to happen. So all sorts of adaptive changes are going to be made.
I just wanted to ask a question that none of you may be capable of answering, so this may be very unfair. But a few weeks ago, I went to a citizenship ceremony of someone who, long-standing EU citizen, lived here, had been hacked off. He didn't get to vote in the referendum, so decided to take out British citizenship, so he could vote, deliberately, so he could vote in this election. We've also seen, so we've got EU citizens who've maybe seen their interests adversely affected by not having British citizenship, maybe taking it on. We've seen an influx as well of Indian, Nigerian, whatever, who automatically have voting rights as Commonwealth citizens. Do we expect them to play any sort of role in the UK election?
Yeah, only locally, the Commonwealth.
No,
citizens.
Commonwealth citizens can vote in national elections.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, you're right. I stand corrected. Yeah.
Move here, Randall.
No. I should know that. 'Cause
Even Canadians
I
can
know
vote.
I voted as one. I've been here for 13 years. Yeah, my mistake. Yeah.
Is this going to have any impacts on this? Or is it at the margins? We're told huge numbers of Indians and Nigerians have come in.
Well, individual constituencies may be, yes. So, I mean, it depends on where they settle. It's all a matter of political geography, really. Yes, but I would guess...
Too marginal to tell. Okay.
Yeah, marginal.
Okay, let's take another question. Too marginal. I should have asked that. I think I did ask that as pollsters. But anyway, let's go. There's somebody right at the back, and then I'll take this question. That'll be... So we'll just have very quick answers from the panel.
Thank you. A quick one. So I think one of the themes of today seems to be that immigration is playing a role in the election, partly because of the competence of the current government. To what extent is the focus of the general election policy versus competence? And assuming Labour win, what lessons does the current incompetent potentially of the government lead?
Okay. And final question, could you wait for the microphone, because otherwise people online can't hear.
I'm interested in the disconnect between what I hear from friends and family to do with mixed race and intermarriage, where so many people now, are, especially at extended family level, have direct experience of migration, the rules, the competency that doesn't seem to be part of the national narrative, yet my sense is a lot of people will make their voting decisions based on the lived experience.
Okay, right, so I'm going to go down the panel. So comment on, it's basically you've got two parties, one of which is saying we'll do much the same policies, the other mob, but we'll do it more competently, including on migration. The other one about how many people are actually sort of personally touched by some of these things, which I think is one reason why so many people are worried about costs and barriers to, actually doing it. Randall, thoughts about, these 2 points, either of them?
Well, let me take the competence versus immigration. I think that's partly how the debate is rolling out. But what's depressing about this is that you have the two main parties both claiming they're going to reduce immigration. That's tactically wise on the part of Starmer because it's going to fall. And so if you promise to reduce immigration that's going to fall anyway, then it's an easy promise to deliver. But it's depressing insofar as it doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is that there's a massive structural dependence in the United Kingdom on low-skilled labor because of the way in which the Conservatives completely destroyed and then won on the back of it in 2019, depressingly enough, well-paid industrial jobs in this country, 2 million of which disappeared between 1971 and 1983, the largest figure in any world. And as I say, the UK is the largest low-paid sector in Western Europe, and that is going to suck in immigrants whether you want them or not. When I went to the Radisson Hotel before Brexit, every worker there was Polish. This morning when I left the hotel, every single worker was South Asian. They are coming here for work, and that's going to continue, and the country needs it, and as was pointed out this morning, skilling up is going to take a generation. So I wish some politician would address that.
It's about control. So British people aren't anti-immigration. They're anti the lack of control over immigration. Some of them, many of them don't care at all. But those that do care, it's about that loss of control. And if a new government can have more perceived competence over how it's controlled, then that will do well for them. And I think the point about upskilling, if young British people and people transitioning from one industry in decline into another, if Labour are seen to be doing more to support that, then I expect they will just be trusted more in handling the whole issue around skills and immigration.
Tim, can you come on to the second question about, because it looks to us as though the Conservative Party has its aging ranks. Quite a lot of people with relatively recent personal experience of the migration system, and it's one of their great successes, and yet...
Strangely enough, some of them are the most anti-immigration MPs. Why the Conservative Party likes them to be the spokesman for that particular line, I'll leave you to contemplate. I mean, you're absolutely right, and in some ways, one of the things that distinguishes the UK from other countries, including the US, I think I'm right, is the rate of so-called mixed marriages. And that's something I think that will have an impact, obviously, on our politics, for a long time to come. I just want to say something about the competence point is important, but also I think, as far as public opinion is concerned, it's the question of trust is really, really important as well. And the fact is, for the Conservative Party, clearly it's lost the trust of the British people when it comes to migration. And that's why, in some ways, migration is such a double-edged sword for this government, because on the one hand, it has this very hardline rhetoric, but on the other hand, it's clear that it's not delivered on the promises that it's made, and that's cost it very, very dear. And the final thing I'll say, it would be great if politicians going forward could not talk about solving immigration as a problem, but talk about managing immigration as a challenge.
I have a question for you, Tim, as the expert in the Conservative Party. Is it the case that you have the most multiracial Conservative Party in history, which is a great achievement, but they're also right-wing, including Badenoch, mixed marriage as well, very good, have a good German name. Is it the case that to make it as a racialized person in the Conservative Party, you have to be more anti-European and more anti-immigration than the mainstream Conservative voter? Because you don't see this in Labour, you just see this in the Tories.
Well, to quote a fictional chief whip, you may think that, I couldn't possibly comment.
Okay, well, that's a very good point to end, and I'm desperately looking for a sign from, excellent. I now know we're on a break. So before we go to the break, could I just thank my excellent panel, Tim Bale, standing in at the last minute. Thanks, Tim. Naomi and Randall Hansen. Thanks very much for sharing their insights. And